Welcome back to Upfront. I'm Kent Wainscott in this week for Mike Goucher. How to tell parents how well schools are doing is shaping up to be one of the legislature's first big issues this year. Last Sunday, we told you about the Assembly bill that would give schools a letter grade and would force failing public schools to become independent charter schools. This past week, members of the state Senate introduced their own school accountability bill. It does not have the same sanction for failing public schools, and we've asked Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald here today to talk about that and to bring us up to date on right-to-work legislation as well. But let's start with schools, Senator. There's a gap between the Senate proposal for school accountability and the Assembly bill right now. Where does it stand? And can you come to some sort of agreement on this?
Yeah, I think you have to go back to last session. It was one of the bills that received a lot of discussion, and there was a lot of different authors, but we never got it completed. So it didn't surprise me that it would be something that the governor would talk about early on in this session, as well as Speaker Vos. And I asked two of my colleagues, Senator Luther Olson and Senator Paul Farrow, to come together and try and work on something that could establish the Senate position, and they did do that, and that's what was introduced this week. I think it's a good bill, and I think it accomplishes what we want to certainly focus on, which is some troubled schools that certainly need more assistance.
But regardless of whether you think it's a good bill, it's not going anywhere unless you can come to some sort of agreement between the two houses. What's the likelihood of that at this point?
There's still a pretty wide gap. I mean, I'm very optimistic. I think we're actually closer to where Governor Walker is and some of the things that he talked about over the last week. So I'm hoping that the Assembly will continue to inch towards where we're at. So it's certainly not something I think that can't be accomplished, but there's a lot of work to still do.
And in the end, the look of education in the state of Wisconsin changes in what way?
I think if we get to the point where there's an actual letter grade that's associated with each school, that will be kind of the mark in which a lot of people say, okay, now I know how my neighborhood school is doing, how it's being perceived based on testing and some other factors as well. But that's something that we haven't done yet. And if we move in that direction, I think that'll be the biggie, is that there's a letter grade associated with schools.
All right, let me ask you about another very high-profile piece of legislation that's been talked about for a long time here in this state, and that is the possibility of a right-to-work bill.
Right.
You said not long ago, we can't put this off anymore. People are talking about it. We have to address this and address it right away. Do you still believe that's the case?
I do. I think it was a good move that in early December that I started talking to my caucus members and started to talk openly in the media about right to work because I think it's kind of brought the whole discussion along. And although we're not counting noses, I'm not certainly as majority leader to see where the votes are. We've had some very good discussions about what is right to work, what would it look like in Wisconsin, who would it affect, and whether or not in the end it's something that can be done here in this state because of the political will of expanded majorities in both houses. I think that's very important and critical to point out. If we would have certainly lost majority in one house, but even if we would not have expanded the majorities, I don't know that there would be as much pressure from those that have been watching this issue for years to say, yeah, it's time to do this. And I understand Governor Walker's point. He's concerned that if right to work would turn into Act 10 and that the Capitol is suddenly swarmed with protesters and everything we went through during Act 10, that it sends a strange message to people outside of Wisconsin that, you know, maybe Wisconsin isn't the place to expand your business or to certainly locate. I'm concerned about that too.
Right to work legislation would prohibit unions from requiring union dues from employees.
Right.
So we do have a history of this. The governor has expressed concerns about what the response, what the reaction would be in this state. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I think probably the biggest change is when Michigan did it. I think a heavily unionized state like Michigan sent a message to a lot of people, both in my caucus and I think certainly new members of the Assembly caucus, and I think the votes are in the Assembly to do it, that you know, this can be a difference maker when we're talking about expanding the economy in Wisconsin and continuing to create jobs. If site selectors, people that say, hey, Wisconsin is a good place to locate if you're a business, if they look at a list of states that are not right to work and dismiss that, and Wisconsin's on that list, it puts us in a bad place. This is a bigger discussion about whether or not we can continue to expand the economy in Wisconsin.
Will it come up for a vote in this session?
I'm hopeful that at some point there will be enough momentum to at least take a vote on the bill itself. When that'll happen or how that'll happen is pretty difficult to say right now.
Right now, do you think there are enough votes for passage?
One thing you have to remember is the 20th Senate seat is still open, and there's a couple of candidates running for Glenn Grothman's old Senate seat, and I think not much would happen until that vacancy is filled. So that'll happen in April.
All right, let me ask you about something else that seems to have hit the fast track, and that is discussion about what's going to happen with the state Supreme Court. We've discussed this earlier in this program, in fact, whether or not we're going to change the rules for the justices. Is it necessary? Is it going to happen?
It's almost, I think, shocking to most people that they don't, as a body, elect who will lead them over a 2-year period. Most of us in the legislature that have operated that way for years have said this is kind of a common sense measure. So yeah, it's going to pass in both houses, and voters throughout the state will have the ability to ratify that. But for me, it's kind of a no-brainer compared to just seniority is kind of the only thing that should be considered when you're talking about who leads our, not just the Supreme Court. You have to remember that one person has control over the entire judicial branch of government in our state, and because of that, I think we can make the case that it's a good thing to do.
Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald, thanks very much for your time.
Good to be with you.
Thanks. We're seeing a lot of movement right now in what's expected to be a very large field of Republican candidates in 2016. Next, what insiders are saying about the chances of these candidates, including Governor Walker. But first, here's the WisPolitics week ahead.
On the eve of a crucial vote on the Milwaukee streetcar, Mayor Tom Barrett makes his case for it Tuesday at an On the Issues event at the Marquette Law School.